Hey everyone, happy Friday. It's 1 o'clock right now. We have a bunch of registrations still coming in. So we will start in a little bit. Just give us a little bit more time to let people trickle in for the next few moments. And we have Tim joining us, who's going to be our instructor for the day. If you have any questions, feel free to ping them in the Q&A and we'll address those as they come up. Also, if you have any questions around the lab setup, give that some time. It takes a while to populate those virtual machines, and then they'll come out to you and we'll get spun up on those. When that happens, it does take some time. So work with us on being patient a little bit and we'll loop back around and make sure that everyone has that. And if anything comes up with that, also reach out in the Q&A for us.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Intro to Purple Team workshop. So thanks for joining us on a Friday. I know that's something that, everyone's time here is valuable. And so being able to join us on a Friday afternoon, hopefully is sort of a fun, this will be a fun exercise for everybody. Let me get my slides up here. So see, we've got people still jumping in. And that's where the VM info stuff, there were some hiccups with how I uploaded stuff. So it's going out, it's finishing uploading now. So that will be slightly delayed, but we've got a portion of this where you're going to be listening to me talk about what we're doing here with purple teaming and sort of the idea behind it. So you should get some of that soon. And that's where, like Chris mentioned, be patient with us a little bit on the lab setup. So those will be coming shortly, probably in the next 10 or so minutes. And while we're doing that, I will walk through some of the just how to do purple teaming. So I do want to wait a few minutes just to let everybody sort of come in and join us. And that way we can keep going when everybody's here. So thanks again for joining us. And yes, this will be recorded. So you'll have access to this afterward. We typically upload them to YouTube. The slides will also be provided. So just wanted to highlight those as sort of kick off the two questions we always get answered. So let's see. Chris, any other fun facts real quick while we're getting the stuff pulled up? While we're waiting for people to jump in, what's your what have you been working on? Let's hear from the detection engineer first, because purple teaming is about leading to building better detections a lot of times. So what are some of the fun things in the detection engineering world?
One of the things that I've been working on recently is Sysmon on Linux. So I think there's a lot of potential there to really start growing some detection capabilities in Linux that wasn't so easy to always get those different log sources set up in Linux, and then being able to actually have that within the Sigma community as well, so people can transfer those around to different products and detections. So yeah, that's one of the interesting areas that I'm looking at. Other than that, I'm happy people are here on a Friday, because if you're here, that means that you don't have a breach that hit on Friday, because that's when they always seem to happen. Friday at like 5 or like one somewhere between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. they always hit. Seems like.
Yeah, I was about to say Felina dropped on a weekend, right? And that was, and then before that, the F5 big IP was also on a weekend. So I definitely think, hoping that nothing else changes out. And yeah, as people mentioned, basically config changes going out on Friday, push to prod right before you go for the weekend. And I think that that's part of the fun. So let me see Chris here. All right. Cool. Well, let's get started with the lecture portion. So let's dive in. And yeah, that's great to see people coming coming from all over the world. Looks like we've got some folks from all around. And to answer a question that popped up in the QA again, the slides will be available afterward. And then we also will have the recording of this. So that's what I think all of this is being recorded. I think you should have gotten a little pop-up when you joined that said it's being recorded so we can upload it after the fact. And that's just something I do like to make sure and talk to. So we've got a bunch of them from previous workshops too. So don't worry, we will have this. We'll have this afterward. So with that, let's jump into a slideshow. See if this will work for me. All right. So a little bit about myself. Oh, and wow, my Twitter's misspelled. That's impressive. So after fixing that, let's jump back into it. So who am I? I'm Tim Shulz. I'm the adversary emulation lead here at Scythe. So I've been here for about 1.5 years now. And prior to my time at Scythe, I was at Sandia National Labs. And also you may have heard of MITRE and be familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. So I worked on some of the teams there. I was an early contributor to the Caldera project, which is sort of what was my first love of doing some of the automation and purple teaming and being able to have sort of a tool or platform that allows you to do that. And so that was sort of what led me to my time here at Scythe. And you may have been to some of these before. So if anyone's joined a previous workshop, then good to see you again. And with that, let's dive into the fun stuff. So this is a hands-on workshop. The idea is that you're going to get individual lab environments. So those, as a couple of folks that joined us really early got to hear, is that there was a little bit of an upload delay from our side of things. And so you should get an email from that out here in a little bit. And I know Chris is working on some of that in the background. So you will get this. It may take some time. The idea is we're going to give you a lecture to introduce sort of the key concepts. And this is actually, you'll have 3 hours of total time in the lab environment. So whenever you get the email, you can go in, you can throw me on mute if you want, but I will walk through some of the lab, just so if you want to, you can either go at your own pace, you can go at the pace with me. And then you'll have you've got a nice manual in there that'll walk you through exactly how you do everything. So it is self-paced. Like I said, if you're, this isn't your first time at a Scythe workshop, then as soon as you get that, as soon as you get that email, you can click on the URL and that will allow you to start doing the lab. So with that, what are we doing here today? We want you to take away a little bit more about how we think about purple teaming here at Scythe. So taking it back to work, understanding some of the value of it. And I think that's sort of the greatest thing, is that purple teaming is sort of a process. We're going to go through a little bit of the Scythe framework and the way that we do it. But overall, we're going to give you some resources. We're going to hopefully give you some new knowledge, and you'll get to play around with our platform a little bit to see how we automate some parts of that. And then, of course, you get CPs at the end of it. So that's sort of the cherry on top. So I like to always start off these things with a success story, right? Why does purple teaming actually matter? And that's, I think this is one of the biggest use cases around purple teaming, is in the transparency of testing. So let's go through something that we did here at Scythe. We did a case study, 6-week purple team exercise, which is a pretty long one, just to be honest. So 6 weeks back to back to back with the NMFTA. They were nice enough to demonstrate or allow us to publish the results of this, as well as use their name. And so we were hired to perform all 3 major roles of red team, blue team, and cyber threat intel. And so the challenge was that we could spend no new money on technology, so $0 technology budget, but you still had to use the current security controls and improve them. And so you've probably been very familiar with this situation, because I think everybody that's worked in an enterprise environment has probably had this sort of challenge before. Is that you don't have a budget, or you've got a very limited budget. How do we maximize what we already have? And so that's where, of course, the challenge of being both the red team and the blue team is that it's really easy to essentially build tests for yourself. And so one of the ways that we made sure that we didn't get too biased towards our own actions was to tie things, of course, to cyber threat intelligence. And that is what we did for choosing our different adversaries. Now, the first week, we had a baseline set of testing, trying to understand what controls were in place, what would be there that we could leverage. And then we started out with APT-19. Sort of when we talk about sophistication, we're talking about threat actors that are leveraging either probably older technologies for low sophistication, or I say something that's maybe a little bit more dated, like command line. Now, it's still useful, but it's something that oftentimes a lot of organizations have tools that are very good at picking out those types of behaviors. And so that's where we started with that. And then we ramped up the different threat actors we use. We switched different geographic regions, of course, because those threat actors have different playbooks that they follow. And so being able to tie everything we do to those threat actors, as well as sort of their escalating uses of technology and different execution methods, enabled us to have this really broad and deep way of testing all of the detections that we were also building and focusing on those behaviors. And the reason we swapped up all those threat actors was that, again, to make sure that we weren't building too many detections that were just to the things we knew we were testing. And then, of course, the nice thing about this is that the last week, the red team can sort of go through and test out and pick out some additional test cases that maybe weren't covered, do a little bit of adaptive emulation and iterative testing to see, are there ways we can break those detections as sort of a way to, again, reinforce any sort of resiliency with this new setup. Now, let's talk about week one, because this is oftentimes the case when we're talking about purple team. You're going to walk into an environment. You're not going to be entirely sure what those expectations are. Maybe you have high expectations, and then you start to execute things. And things either aren't detected, they aren't alerted, they don't have what you would expect to happen. That's a key reason to actually record what your assumptions are beforehand, because that is super critical. All of that data, even if it's not going to give you information you really like, it's still important to measure the difference between what you have and what you're doing versus what you can verify is true. And so in this case, we had 94% was not detected. And this was things that weren't detected and weren't able to be even detected on. So there's no logging, that kind of thing. And so that was, we did have one test case that gets blocked. And this is where the focus on prevention, when we're talking about doing testing, that has been something that's been a historic way of focusing on networks, right? Is having a really, tall walls around your internet, like, or your internal castle, so to speak, and making sure that nobody can get in. But oftentimes if people do get in, there's not a lot of additional defenses internally. And so that was sort of the case here as well. As soon as something got in, there was no detections around it. But there is a happy ending to the story. And in only 6 weeks, we have this measured improvement of 64% detected. So the key thing here was enabling more telemetry, Sysmon. And for anybody that's leveraged Sysmon before, it's a ton of data. So there is some configuration and tuning and that kind of thing that has to happen. But that's part of why you do purple teaming as an exercise, is to figure out what is the amount of data that we can get with something like Sysmon. How do we leverage it with, in this case, it was Adversary, was the SIM that they had deployed. And so the cool part of this was going through that entire process, working with the Adversary as a vendor that they had, in addition to deploying some of those new technologies in Sysmon. And so this is a measured result. And that's where, I challenge everyone, like, how much of a change can you have doing some purple teaming in your organization? And hopefully we can help equip you with that. Now, if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about this, we do have an entire talk around this. It's around 55 minutes. And this has got Bryson Bort and George Orchiez, Bryson's our CEO, George is our CTO. You probably know them. They're also, very active on Twitter and within the community, sort of pushing things back. And so they gave a great talk around this. The other really cool thing, and this is, again, sort of the fun part of purple teaming, is that we have a SIM blog from Adversary that tagged all of those detections that Scythe built as part of this, and then was able to push it out to all of their customers. And that to me is why this is such a success story when we're talking about purple teaming, is we're not even just equipping the individual organization that we did this purple team exercise on, but also the broader community. And we did have, like I said, these published so that other people could understand what we deployed and how we tested. So good stuff. Highly recommend it. Again, slides will go out afterwards. The recording will be here so that you can leverage this and check it out later. So let's talk about, I've talked about how great Purple Team is. Let's dissect and dive into what is a Purple Team. First, it's of course the merging of red and blue teams from on the color wheel, right? But a context that I like to give is why purple, why now, right? And so we've had blue teams, we've had red teams, and they've sort of had an adversarial relationship in the past. And part of that is because blue teams are focused, they have focus on defending the whole enterprise. And oftentimes red teams are a lot made up of a lot of creative individuals that they can try and figure out what are the things that are going to thread the needle and be able to bypass all the defenses in place. And so this is the reason Purple Team, I think, really came about, is because of this addition of cyber threat intelligence. And the reason why this was such a big thing is CTI enabled red teams to be scoped to something that real adversaries are doing. If you have a really good red team and say, do whatever you can, that red team will oftentimes be more sophisticated than your typical adversaries. And so that's a challenge that we've seen over time, is that red teams actually are going above the adversaries that'll target an organization. And so cyber threat intel allows both a focus on the red team side of scoping down those techniques to something that real adversaries are doing. And we'll talk about sources for that here in a little bit. But it also provides the blue team with a set of information around what types of TTPs adversaries that are targeting their organization might have, so they can also focus their efforts a little bit more on trying to defend against specific adversaries or adversary sets, instead of having to try and do everything, which is really hard, if not impossible, right? Because of all the different technologies that are being introduced today, and maybe not a complete understanding of all of the risks associated with deploying them. So with that background, let's talk about why we would do purple teaming. There's a couple of things here that I think are really big. One is training defenders. Like, this is a big thing, especially when we talk about detection engineering and hunting teams. Would you rather have data that an adversary puts there that then you have to, of course, do an incident response in addition to trying to build detections on, or having a red team that goes through this purple team process we're going to talk about, put essentially practice data that you can then build off detections? And so this is one of those things that especially we've seen a lot of teams have moving people these days, right? There's a lot of different organizations that are being that have, high turnover. It's a tight labor market. And so being able to train up new or junior people on your internal processes, especially when doing incident response, is very critical. And so that's where having a purple team exercise can really help train and bring those new people up in a very efficient way. Testing the processes between teams. This is another big one, especially when we get into SOCs and security, like organizations that have very large security teams. When you have a multi-level SOC, for instance, or teams that have to coordinate, especially in that incident response, or before we even trigger an incident response, that's where testing both the people and the process is equally important as also testing the technology and those controls. And so that's where something, I'll talk a little bit about how we do that with purple teaming. Of course, testing TTPs. So if your red team comes up, or you have cyber threat intelligence that comes up with a report of a new vulnerability or a new technique that's come out, the best way to test that is not hope that an adversary executes it in your environment and you try and find it. It's, of course, having a team, having an exercise that enables somebody to go and execute this. And then, of course, you can build tests and detections around it. And then this gets to our sort of final one on this, on sort of the main parts of doing purple teaming, which is replaying red team engagements. Most red teams that I've talked to are booked 2 to 3 months out, and that's most of the times at a minimum. So one of the challenges in today's world, of course, is that we have, these vulnerabilities that are coming out at a more regular cadence. And it requires a scramble, it requires patching, it requires making sure that defenses are in place, because adversaries also have a shorter turnaround time with when a vulnerability is disclosed versus when they're using it in engagements or, well, in their operations. And so being able to replay a red team engagement allows your team to essentially have this ability to sort of replay on demand a bunch of different ways to tie things together. And this is so you don't have to wait that 10 to 12 weeks, which might even be longer, to get a team to come back and test those changes that you did as the result of previous engagements. And so change management tends to happen faster than that. Now, not in every organization. So I know we've got a big group of folks on here, but that's really what I want to talk about. Is it's about building this collaborative culture and where people are talking to each other, and it's breaking down some of those silos. It's breaking down some of those barriers. And I just want to say that I think that's something that's super critical, is being able to do that. Now, a couple other things I'll highlight too is bake-offs, things like that. If you have several different tools and you want to see what they're doing, having transparent testing allows you to see and compare results. So that's a big thing. Control validation. This goes to that testing TTPs again, but that's just a couple of things that I want to highlight with sort of how to frame some of these as well. Now, assume breach testing. This is something that has been sort of taking over as one of the bigger ways to test, especially as we've seen more pen tests and attack surface management is sort of focusing on that external. Now, that's not to say that they can't go internally, but the reason assume breach is so powerful is we just start on the inside of that network edge and work from there. And the nice thing about this is that while the idea that assuming you've already been breached can sometimes be sort of a tough pill to swallow, because it is something that it takes admitting that maybe you would get breached. And even if you have an outstanding team, you have a really good set of perimeter security tools and configurations, there's always 0 days. There's always insider threats, that kind of thing. And so that's where I really like to talk about, like, this sort of eliminates some of that part of it, where you can say, let's assume that this scenario, there was a 0 day, there was an insider threat. What does our detections look like against those types of threats? And that's where assume breach really pays off. Now, another thing, so if you haven't come from the red team space, initial access testing takes a lot of time. There's always this assumption that red teams will be able to get in, right? It's some combination of social engineering, trying to create custom payloads, that kind of thing. It takes time. And let me tell you, you are paying for that time. That's always the case. If you require initial access testing, a lot of times that is going to increase the cost of red team engagements, or it's already baked in because the red teams assume they have to do that. Using an assume breach method oftentimes can cut down that time and potentially cut down the cost. So not going to be true in all cases, but that's something that in my experience, at least when I've scoped out red team engagements, if we have to do initial access, that does increase the cost typically, because that requires additional infrastructure, where what are we really trying to test at that point? And most of the time, at the end of the day, a phishing email, a spear phishing email gets through with potentially a payload. And what does that really tell us? And so that's something where I'm a big fan of it. I've written a whole blog around why you should assume breach, but it's not the only way to test. So that's where I just want to say, remind everyone you do have options. You're going to know some of your context of why you're trying to test things better than I. But this is where, when we're doing purple team engagements to try to get the most out of our time, we do use assume breach testing. Now, we do have a purple team exercise framework. And so here's the link. So you can go download it, call it PTEF. There's version 2 now. So we have updated this. The first version came out, I think, in 2020. And then we've updated it since. So the first version was very focused on sort of the large enterprise way of having a purple team. And with our version 2, we've tried to sort of broaden that audience of leveraging purple team, just who can leverage it, of course, and how to leverage the framework. It's not that only large enterprises can use it, but we wanted to make sure that we had language, we had examples, things like that, and how, even if you're a one-person team or a student or that kind of thing, how you can leverage the purple team exercise framework to essentially walk yourself through this process, because you always learn something new every time. So one of the big things in here that we tried to outline, and this is always the thing when you're creating a framework, is like, how prescriptive are you? And if you're over prescriptive, then people tell you like, this isn't realistic because I can't fit this into my environment, versus too general to where people don't know how to actually take it and leverage it. And so we tried to really make it a combination of both of those things, where it does have some level of prescription so you can walk through it. We have these roles and responsibilities outlined, but also know that sometimes it's going to be like, in this case, the roles and responsibilities, it might be you wearing the same hat for all of these. And so this is really what that purple team exercise breaks down to, is this process is where you're going to, in this case, we've got it tied to specific roles. The exercise coordinators taking the cyber threat intelligence that has been a driver for this. They're presenting the adversary, why the adversary matters, some of the details of what's going to be tested. You have a tabletop discussion of just what are we expecting, right? When we execute this command, is this going to be a block? Is this going to be a detect? Is it going to be an alert? That kind of thing. Writing all of that down, and then to another level of detail, which tool do we expect to do that? Especially in environments where you have multiple overlapping tools, this might be not as easy as you think of a question to answer. And then, of course, we go to actually executing that technique. That's sort of the ground truth. And then we go through our response process. What does this look like? What was able to capture the data that we just ran? And then detection engineering, which is its own process. We'll talk a little bit about that. This is something that if there's a part of this that gets sort of substituted out, so to speak, it would be detection engineering, not because it's bad, but because not every team has the ability to push new detections out at the rate of every time you go through a procedure. So that's just something that it's not really, I wouldn't really say it's optional, but realistically in every environment and organization we've been in, it is a little different on how change management is processed. So that's just something that I do like to call out, is that while this is the ideal, this is going to be something that you can break it up and do things. But I always recommend people go through our process at least once, so you understand why we put this in before you start trying to customize it to your own needs. And then, of course, you can repeat this over and over again. You can either rerun that same TTP to see if you did have detection engineering. How does that new detection fire? Does it fire off as we would expect? And you can go through this process, or you can go through an entire emulation plan and chain and sort of work on change management afterward. So let's talk about different roles. Exercise coordinator. So this is, you are going to have to start with cyber threat intelligence. So if you've never heard of CTI or you're not familiar with it, this is going to be, a rabbit hole to send you down. Is that there's a bunch of different threats. Part of this is determining what are those threats that are targeting you. What is their intent, right? If banks, right, are an easy example because they have money, right? And that's one of the sort of easy examples from why they would be targeted, is that people want money. And so what is the capability of threat actors that are targeting banks? And so there are different ways that you can get this information. We'll of course talk about MITRE ATT&CK in a minute, but that's the kind of thing that you're trying to look and map that out so you can understand where should we put our defensive resources? Because even at banks, right, at any organization, you have a budget that you have to work in. And so that's where trying to understand the capabilities of your adversary will also allow you to better understand where you need to deploy your capabilities as a defender. And then opportunity. This is something that can adversaries take advantage of a new vulnerability that's been disclosed, right? Felina, some of those other ones that come out. That's really what's big, is trying to understand what those threat actors, how quickly they can turn things around. Maybe threat actors targeting your space are way behind, or take 6 months or something like that in order to take that. Because I like to remind everyone, that's something that adversaries have expertise they have to rely on too. And so if their expertise is tied up doing other things, and then an opportunity presents itself, they may not have the time to turn that around as they normally would. So adversaries are people too, in the sense that they have deadlines, they have limited resources. It may not be as limited as your resources, but also remember that a lot of times they are trying to hit such a broad range of targets that's something to keep in mind. So all these different components of a threat, you should at least look at it. Now, the easy way to do some threat modeling, or at least what I used to go in and ask people, is what's your nightmare scenario, right? If something's going to appear in a newspaper and it's got your company name in it, what do you not want it to say? And so those are the types of things that can help lead you to what are those adversaries that would try and do that. And there you go. Now you've identified an adversary, or maybe a geopolitical opponent, that kind of thing, that would give you an idea on how to think about this and how to approach it. And then, of course, you have to go get data. So another thing I like to showcase is some of the challenges of threat modeling. This came out from the Department of Defense here, and they had the Defense Science Board. It's called their tier description of tiered threats. Now, one of the challenges with this is that if we look at it, we have different tiers and it goes in escalating maturity. But of course, one of the challenges is almost every team says, we're ready for that top tier, because no one wants to say we're starting at the bottom. And that's something that has been a challenge when it comes to threat modeling, is people want to go against, what they see as the most sophisticated threats, when realistically there's very few organizations that can defend against some of those threats. And it tends to be something you have to mature to. And so that's where, I do showcase this just as another example, but it is something that I've had difficulty in getting buy-in for anything essentially other than true nation state threat actors. So just something to bring up. Now let's talk about what you can do once you've picked out that. You've got MITRE ATT&CK. Now you've probably heard of this. If you might be sick of it by now. ATT&CK is something that is very common. MITRE put it out. And the idea behind it was that it was this categorizing this all adversary behaviors that we keep seeing in different reports. Now, a lot of the vendors, cyber threat intelligence vendors, EDRs, that kind of thing, all put out these reports about what adversaries they are doing, how they're blocking things, that kind of thing. It's sort of a combination of marketing material, but of course it does have data in it that is valuable. And so that's where the challenge goes back to our red team, blue team discussion, where blue teams are seeing one aspect of, they're seeing the defenses, they're seeing those IP addresses that people are attacking, maybe a couple of the different procedures, the pieces of malware that people are executing. And red teams are on the other side of that because they're designing those things or attacking from them. And so there really wasn't a great common language to talk about how adversaries are doing attacks. And that's where MITRE ATT&CK really came in, and it provides these layers of abstraction. Across the top, you have tactics. Those are the overall goals of adversaries, and underneath each of these are the techniques. And so those techniques are the means by which adversaries achieve those overall goals. And then we also have procedures, and there's sub-techniques and some of that gets into more granular details for each of these. And so you can explore it. It's attack.mitre.org. And the cool thing about this too is that they only tie in things that have been seen in real world threats. And so this is something that's really critical, because I come from a security research background. And while researchers can come up with a lot of really cool and potentially theoretical or even create proof of concepts for techniques, the problem these days is scale. Adversaries, like I mentioned, are attacking not just one organization typically, but they're attacking places all over the globe. And so if a technique does not scale, if you are not able to give it to potentially tens or hundreds of operators that are going to leverage it, it's not necessarily going to be a technique that gets used that often. And so that's why it's critical to even scope down all of those different bypasses and stuff that you may read about from security researchers are great. And sometimes those do get used by adversaries, but MITRE ATT&CK does take those things and it only focuses on what we have seen real adversaries do. So it is sort of a scope down view already, even if this is your first or second time looking at attack, it may not seem like it. So this is my way of doing attack threat modeling. You pull up the search bar and you type in your industry. So in this case, I picked defense industry. You see there's some groups, and that's the other cool thing about attack is it has ties to tactics, techniques, procedures, but it also has the different adversarial groups. And so there's lots of different names, different vendors have a bunch of different names for them. That's sort of a cyber threat intelligence, like course in and of itself is on the naming schemes. But the idea behind this is that you get started. Put something, whether you're in hospitality, whether you are in medicine, that kind of thing, defense, aerospace, you can type those things in and you're going to get some of these group names. The APT, the CrowdStrike has the names like Fancy Bear and that kind of thing. And so you can see those groups and it shows all the reports. And this is the other important thing about attack is it cites the sources for all of those attacks. And so you can go through and explore exactly what reports gave specific techniques. And this allows you to go through and have a start, because not everyone's done threat modeling before. You don't have to be a threat modeling expert. In fact, doing threat modeling this way is often a little different. If you start searching threat modeling, a lot of times it's been used in software engineering, which is there's some great talks that sort of bridge the gap between the way of thinking for software engineering and also, of course, how to do it for looking at different threat actor groups. And so Katie Nichols did a great talk on that. So I just want to at least call that out. And she did a talk, let's see, I think it was at ShmooCon a couple years back. So just check, ShmooCon, Katie Nichols, and she's a fantastic resource for threat intelligence. By the way, highly recommend following her on Twitter if you haven't already. So going back to our role as the exercise coordinator, this might be, after you do some of that research, what it looks like when you're presenting the adversary. And in this case, we're using APT3. It's a China-based threat group in this case. And that's where you've got all of these different names that different vendors have given. Now, this is, again, almost all the information has been pulled from the MITRE ATT&CK page. So they have different campaigns, and some of the times those campaigns means they're using different malware. And so this is where you get into the complexities of CTI. If you want to dive into those rabbit holes. But the idea is you're just giving an idea of, here's the adversary, here's why we are using them as our adversary emulation for the purple team exercise. Now, a couple of ways you can go get other information about this. We have Threat Thursdays. That's something we release monthly. We introduce the adversary as a part of them. So it's an entire blog post. It gives you exactly how we've consumed cyber threat intel. So if you've never built an adversary emulation plan before, have no fear. We walk you through exactly how we go and walk through the different reports. And then we have an adversary emulation plan. And so we've got the plans on our GitHub page. This is community threats is what we call it. We've also had other people that have contributed their own plans that they've built. So shout out to all the contributors on that. And then, of course, you go into how do we actually emulate the adversary? What are those commands that we execute? But one of the other big things is not only do we tell you how to execute these, but how to defend against them. Shout out to Chris who's on here, because Chris has done an amazing job working with the Sigma project. And that's shout out to Florian Roth for his creation of that, continuing to shepherd that entire project of vendor agnostic detections. And so these can be translated and put into different EDRs and SIMs. But the idea behind it is that we give you those detections in Sigma rules. And Chris, in some cases, has actually built new rules to when we've identified gaps. And that's something that we continue to also link on some of those blog posts. So they're meant to be like, some of them are big, but the idea is that we wanted to make sure that they're thorough and that they're very high quality, is that we're giving you the CTI from that we're sourcing it from. And that's something that I'd highly recommend you check those out. So this is, for going back to the exercise coordinator, we've presented exactly what our threat actor has done, or in this case, this is another example of how you might present the TTPs and things that you're going to do. In this case, this is Orange Worm, and this was targeting the healthcare sector. And so that's, again, if you're doing your threat modeling, you're in healthcare, this would be potentially a good example. And it gives you a breakdown of all of those techniques. You could also break it into the procedures. This is something that is going to depend on what you're trying to do with the purple team exercise, what level of detail you go into versus keeping things at a higher abstract level. Tabletop. This is one of those things that is always interesting to go through, especially when people know that right after they answer, you're going to test and verify what they say. And what that's means, at least in our experience, is that we've seen a lot of times there's a lot of discussion around it more than, yeah, this will stop it, and just expecting it to. Is that people do have to think about it, because I mean, no one's going to get necessarily a bad score if they're wrong, but it's one of those things that if you think it's going to block, everything is going to get blocked and none of it does, then there's a big misunderstanding between what your defensive controls are capable of. And so that's where going through this tabletop exercise of what do we expect to happen? Do we have preventative measures in place that are going to trigger? If not, what are those logging sources that then people, like whether it's tools or your people, are building detections on top of and analysis on top of? So that's where an out of the box EDR with no tuning is going to be something that, like, this is Jake Williams, our executive director for cyber threat intelligence, talked about this a few weeks back, that what can EDRs, like what do adversaries test against when they are trying to figure out how to bypass an EDR? They only have the out of the box version for the most part, if they're able to get access to it with no tuning. And so anytime you do extra tuning on that EDR, if you have custom rules, that kind of thing, adversaries are not going to have that information on all of those changes you've made. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's going to make you more resilient against these types of things. But a lot of people assume that, hey, we spent all this money on an EDR, it should just work. And that's the challenge with that, is every business context is a little different. And so that's going to depend highly on your industry. How you do business is going to affect what types of things are going on in your network and what normal looks like. And so that's just something I always like to tie into, is that anytime you can go through this exercise, it does tend to be really beneficial, because you can get an understanding also of what are the types of tools people are looking for. So let's give a quick little example here, a war story of when we did a purple team exercise one time. There was the people that we were working with were very familiar with a specific SIM. And so they were using that for all of their threat hunting. And anytime we executed something, the SIM was the place they were looking. But they also had an EDR, and they had the EDR sending alerts to their SIM, which is great, except the EDR was collecting all this additional information that wasn't getting sent to the SIM. So they weren't able to find information. We asked them, hey, let's go into the EDR. Let's start looking through the data here. And it turned out there was a lot of information that they had no idea the EDR was collecting that allowed them to have better hunts within the EDR's interface. So that's the kind of thing that you can expose some bias towards tools and that kind of thing, especially if you have teammates that are very good at specific tools. They're going to lean on that every time. Like, that's the red team operators are the same way. If they know a tool well, they're going to use that over and over again before switching. And so that's where it's good to break out of that every so often and see whether or not other tools can also do the job that you would think. Now, what responses are we anticipating? This goes to that process. Like, what do we expect from a tier 1 analyst versus when it's going to get escalated to tier 2 or tier 3? What do those processes look like? And what are those TTPs that will trigger them? Having this conversation is something that is really good, because as we talk about at the bottom here, it gives you a baseline. It gives you something to work off of. The number of teams that we've gone into and done a purple team exercise that have a 100% understanding of exactly what's going to happen has been 0. There's always something different in place, and that's not always a negative. Sometimes they're like, I don't think this is going to get detected. And then it turns out it does. So that's the kind of thing that's really nice to see. And purple teaming just gives everyone that ground truth to work off of. Now, actually testing things. How do you do this? Now, atomic red team is a big one in this space. That's sort of everyone always recommends atomic red team as a starting point. They have some additional tools, atomic test harness, invoke atomic, that kind of thing. And it's grown over the years. It's a community driven effort. Red Canary is sort of the maintainer of it. And then we've had, in this case, like Swim Lane is is a I just forgot what they did all of a sudden, but they're a SOAR platform, and they also released Atomic Operator, which is a Python executor for this. And then Datadog has released Stratus Red Team, which bills itself as sort of the Atomic Red Team for the cloud. And so it leverages Terraform and things like that to test different cloud tests. So you've got a bunch of different open source tools there to leverage to get started. But let's talk also about some of the challenges around this and why we talk about attack abstraction. I just told you how awesome attack is. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the challenges with it. So using an example here for process discovery, T1057. You don't have to have this memorized. I'll tell you what these are, and then you can look at afterward. A way to execute process discovery is taskless. But the challenge with this is it's not actually just one technique. You actually need to execute taskless somehow. It tends to be Windows command line, which is a different attack technique. And this is sort of the secret of MITRE ATT&CK, is that it takes at least two techniques. You tend to have something that you're doing, the end result may be process discovery and an execution method. And that's at a minimum. It doesn't account for command and control, that kind of thing. And so let's talk about some other ways to run this exact same technique. Now, all three of these have been identified in MITRE ATT&CK as ways adversaries have done this. But a lot of times when using Atomic Red Team, it becomes a checkbox exercise to see, did we check the single box of a specific MITRE ATT&CK technique, T1057? And so that's where, whenever we've come in and done purple teams with people that have done this in the past, that's my next follow-up question. If somebody says we've tested this technique, is what is that procedure? Because you can't execute a technique. You can execute a procedure, but that's where I just like to remind everyone that MITRE ATT&CK is great for, again, getting that cyber threat intelligence and being able to get those reports on what adversaries are doing. But it very much remains a useful layer of communication and abstraction, where when we're actually building tests, we do want to have mappings to it, but we do have to get into this level of detail. And so task list was the only thing Atomic Red Team had. There have been some changes. I pushed up some of these additional tests, but the part of Atomic that I also like to talk about is most of it is focused on what you can execute with the command line and with PowerShell, because it is the Atomic part of it is that condensed one thing. And so any technique that requires multiple steps is something that technically would fall outside of Atomics, and they have some ways of leveraging that. But another thing is, this is another way to call and get process discovery. It's a native API call, also used by real adversaries and real malware as cited in MITRE ATT&CK. But this does not have an Atomic Red Team test. And so these are the types of things that I like to showcase, is not to just poke holes in Atomic Red Team. It's a great project, but to show that there are limitations to it, and it is a stepping stone on your way to maturity, and being able to recognize the depth of testing that you're doing at the procedure level is really important, because that's something that if you're able to say we did T1057, and then that was a critical part of an adversary that does compromise you, that report afterward is going to be, oh, I thought we tested this. Why didn't we detect it? And so this is the depth that each technique can go into. And so that's what I just like to sort of expose that and talk about it. Now, command and control is another aspect when we're talking about Atomic Red Team and tests. You do have to add some element of command and control in order for it to be something that is like a real adversary, especially when we get into specific techniques like living off the land binaries and scripts, lolbins, lolbas. The project is called lolbas, but it's one of those things that this is one of the key ways we recommend people at least start off with trying to separate out false positives, because there's a ton of information inside of a network. There's a ton of legitimate use cases for a lot of those different programs. And so checking to see that run DLL32, if it starts spawning network connections, that's probably something to look at. So that's where you're not going to be able to test that unless you have a component of command and control also to your testing. So how do you do this combination of both? Well, I'm going to show you in another open source project. We're going to talk a little bit about this kind of stuff so that you can, of course, have these afterwards. And then you'll get to use Scythe, of course, and get to see how you can do this with our platform and how we've tried to simplify and make this a much easier process. So C2 Matrix is a tool or it's a big sheet in Google, but it is a tool for helping decide what types of testing you want to do and what are some of the projects out there that you can leverage. It does have some free and paid options, so you can do comparisons. It's got things like Scythe, it's got Cobalt Strike, that kind of thing. And it's maintained by people at a couple of different companies that do try and test these things out and sort of populate it. So if you haven't used any of these before, I'd highly recommend checking it out. There's also SANS has released this Slingshot C2 Matrix, which has a bunch of these set up, because if you've never messed with open source projects before, typically it does take some setup because these are people's, a lot of times, side projects and sort of passion projects or something that they've built for work in doing their very specific scenarios. So it does take some setup if you've never used them before. And that's what the SANS C2 Matrix VM gives you, is a bunch of them that are set up so you can at least play around with it. Let's talk about Scythe. Though I'm going to just hit on this just briefly. Enterprise grade platform for adversary emulation. So you're going to get to play around with it. This is a little slick sheet for you to go and reference afterward, but you do get to use this in the VMware Learning platform, so you don't have to worry about it. Now let's talk about, we've executed our tests. Now we get to the blue team. And this is really the big things here. It's like, are there alerts? What were the responses? And determining whether or not something, if it's informational or low severity or that kind of thing, is that appropriate for what you would expect? For something running like discovery commands, who am I? That kind of thing, you're probably not going to necessarily expect a detection. Although on who am I these days, that might be an illegitimate detection, because most things move over to like PowerShell and that kind of thing. So that's where it's going to take you understanding your environment, or at least being able to look at your environment to see, is there a lot of false positives if we were to make this an alert? If you have 1,000 events a day from it, that's probably something that having it as a high alert is going to just cause a lot of problems and a lot of noise. And of course, all of this comes down to, are there logs, right? Do you have data that's been collected so that you can leverage analysis and do all the things on top of it? If you don't have the data, you can have really, really good people and they can't do anything with it because they don't have anything to work off of. So you have to have some data for people to use, because that's going to be what they leverage when they are trying to do either an incident response or trying to understand why a technique did or did not succeed. So this is something that I always like to highlight, is that the alert response process, right, and incident response process is not an automated thing. Despite that, there's a lot of tools that do help with the automation. I mean, and you'll see when we're talking about automating and building test cases that we're going to automate, you still have that human element of, if you have a SOC that's going to receive an alert, if you have a multi-tier SOC, what is that escalation process? How does this get analyzed? And that's really critical. And that's why when we talk about evaluating people, process, and technology, is when we go through purple team exercises, we follow that chain of escalation. We've had it where we literally had a 3-tier SOC. So the typical 3-tier SOC model. And so we did a screen share, and we had the level 1 SOC analyst show us what they were looking at. Here's the indicators that made it so they decided this is something that I think should be escalated. And so they went through the escalation process. They stopped sharing their screen. The level 2 analyst popped up theirs. And so we walked through that entire process, including who got notified when, like in what case was it actually considered an incident, as well as what are some of the artifacts that they leverage to trigger that. And so that's the kind of process that you want to go through. And it's going to be a slow process, probably the first couple times you're going through this, as you're getting initial buy-in on your purple team activities. But it is something that gives you a really good idea of whether there is a documented incident response process or playbook. And this goes back to that training blue teamers and people that are going to be responding to a crisis. You don't want them to be learning what they should be looking for while they're also trying to respond to ransomware, right? That is a bad learning environment for anybody. And so that's something that if we can walk through that before it happens, great. All right, let's talk a little bit about detection engineering, because this is one of those other big pieces. And also, just to talk about one of the other use cases I mentioned earlier, I mean, detection engineering, depending on whether or not you have the internal skills, expertise, that kind of thing, this might be that part that you're either going to sub out, or you're going to, you'll be essentially done. If you're doing a bake-off, for instance, and you want to understand, all right, what are if we run this TTP between these 4 different vendors, okay, we've got our responses, and detection engineering may be a follow-on questions that you have around how do they triage those things. But overall, that might be all the information you need to at least evaluate those vendors for that specific task case. So that's where, just to pull back a little bit on that, on some of the different use cases I discussed, detection engineering is something that assumes right, you're going to be working with something in an environment over and over again. So with that, we want to move, David Bianco's pyramid of pain. Again, this is something that's widely cited, back from 2013. This is before even MITRE ATT&CK, but the focus on adversary behaviors, because you do have a lot of vendors and controls that already have a lot of those for you. Hash values, IP addresses, domain names, that kind of thing. You're going to get those information from IOC feeds, that kind of thing. And so that's where the tough part of this is, having to diagnose those false positives from true positives when you're looking at the behaviors, because adversaries do them because they're on the systems already, and because it's harder to detect because you have to determine the intent behind those actions. And so that's why when we're doing detection engineering, when we're doing adversary emulation, we really like to hone in and focus on those TTPs. Now, credit to Chris again for our TTP pyramid. This was sort of our update that Chris published around how do we break this down, TTPs, like what are the best ones to get. Now, you've heard me talk some about procedures. You got to see the example with Atomic Red Team, where there's all those different ways to execute the same technique. And that is sort of further illustrated here with tactics and techniques are still a very broad base to work off of when we're talking about TTPs. And that's where procedures are the thing that are going to be what you can execute, what you can build detections on. And while techniques and tactics are great, sometimes you might have to fill in the procedures if you don't get that information from your CTI vendors, for instance, but you at least have some information to work off of. The less information you have, the more you're going to have to guess, more it's going to be a little bit of an art form. But that's where procedures are the tip of this pyramid. And that's something that we are continuing to push more and more here at Scythe and across industry, is that focus on procedures. Shout out to Red Canary in their reports, because they do provide procedures in a lot of their reports. Same with the DFIR report. We're big fans of both of them. And you might ask, why doesn't everybody provide procedures? And sometimes it's because it is providing those procedures might be revealing of where those vendors have, where they might have specific access to, right? There might be something in that procedure that allows people to understand where they got that information, or there might be sensitive company information in them. And so there are some discussions going around about how to have some more anonymized procedures, or in some cases, they are pretty generic because they're widely used in the case of ransomware. So those tend to get shared more broadly. But there are discussions in place around some of that, and always happy to hear more discussions from people around how we can help drive this just across the industry. So data collection is a big thing here, of course, when you are doing detections, because you can't work from nothing. You've probably heard me say that now a couple of times. You have to have data collection at the key places where adversaries are going to be executing things. And that's why you'll see here, there's this really nice breakdown by Detect, which is another great project. Highly recommend checking it out. That ties the different data collection methods to MITRE ATT&CK techniques on where you need to be getting information. Command execution, process creation, as you can see, are two of the biggest things there, because that's going to give you things like command line arguments, and then process creation, being able to track parent and child processes is extremely important when you're trying to do correlation between events. So there's a bunch of others there. And of course, different adversaries are going to have different ways that they execute it, but being able to have the data of what adversaries are executing is going to give you some insight into how to build your defenses or detections around it. So this is that whole detection engineering process. We already mentioned that CTI is a driver for everything. It's a driver for our purple team engagement, our testing, and whether that CTI is internal, maybe a team member has an idea or a new thing that they want to test. But overall, the idea is that we're worried about adversaries doing this specific technique. And so that's what's going to drive us to say, we need to start building a detection around this or understand how our environment can handle this if it comes up. And so that's where we'll talk about collection already, getting all of the data. And then, of course, there's processing and analysis on top of that to determine what is the intent. Is there more information that you can add that would give you a better chance at getting that right? And then, of course, this dissemination of your resources afterward. What is that output? Is that something that it turned out we determined that this was going to be low risk, and so we're not worried about it, or it's something that is extremely high risk, and so we definitely need to make sure that we have senior leadership understanding, and maybe why you need a budget increase, right, around things. So let's dive into that a little bit. We've already talked about collection, but also, again, tying back to my story about the SIM versus the EDR and understanding that architecture in your network, that's going to give you where these logs are found so that you know where your data is gathered. Lots of data is stored everywhere, whether it's in a firewall or something else. And so if you don't have a data aggregator, do you have a way to get that information if you need it, right? In an incident response, do you have the knowledge of where everything is so you can start piecing together all of the bits and pieces you need to? And of course, the big thing here is trying to identify gaps in logging. It's one of the worst things is if an incident happens and you don't have logs, or you aren't able to detect a certain technique or even see a certain technique because it wasn't logged. Now, there's always going to be some things that are like this. And that's where I mentioned, like, if you've ever deployed Sysmon, you get so much data. And so there's ways to deal with that. You've got Olaf has a modular Sysmon project. Swift on Security also has a very good project and sort of base Sysmon configuration to work off of. But the idea is to try and reduce your gaps as much as possible, because then that's when you are able to work off of a lot more data, and you're going to have a better chance of getting the information and outcomes you want. So, of course, you also want to say, what are the chances I'm going to be able to build detections off of this, right? Just because we can collect the data of someone running Who Am I does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a good detection opportunity in your environment, because you might find out that there's a lot of people that run Who Am I, or a lot of programs. So these are the things you need to be thinking of when you're going through it. So MITRE has done a really good job of trying to build a better way to tie techniques to the different data components and data sources you need in order to write those. So that's something, just want to give you a shout out there. And of course, continuing to check it out. So Attack is a great resource. They are continuing to build things. They have heard the sort of greater community talk more about procedures, and they are looking at sort of tying more campaigns and things like that in the future. So, keep an eye on their roadmap. They are continuing to change things. So they have their big updates in April and October of every year. So this was a big thing they did last year. So that's where just mapping all of these things out. Detect also has another nice tool that allows you to do it just all in one. So you're not necessarily going piecemeal between all of these. And then, of course, you've got like the Sysmon event ID and the Windows event ID, depending on what you're trying to work with in your environment. Now let's talk about processing, right? This is analysis. This is one of those things where you want to cast that wide net, right? And let's talk about living off the land binaries and scripts, right? Run DLL32. If you try and capture every time something on an operating system, well, on Windows, uses run DLL32, you are going to be just flooded, right? So that's your wide net. But then saying, and is initiating, right, network connections. that's going to make that net a lot smaller. And so this is where you're going to have some of those that you test out. What are the things in my environment that would make the way adversaries use this technique unique? So it's going to pop out, right? And that you can have that really good detection off of it. And so that's really what this whole process is about, is going through those and fine tuning them. There is unfortunately not really a one size fits all, because like I mentioned, because most businesses do things a little bit differently, they have different histories, they have different technology stacks. It's going to take knowing your environment and catering and building things tailored to your environment to really fine tune this. And that's what's going to make you able to catch adversaries, is understanding what that normal state looks like. Now, of course, dissemination. And again, we've got another really good resource here. Palantir's got their alerting and detection strategy framework. So lots of additional frameworks and things to work off of. And it breaks down some of those goals, and you can sort of fill that out based on your own organization, right? Who needs to get the output of some of these detection engineering? Is this part of a purple team exercise like we're going through now? Or is it something else? And that this is sort of a separate process, a separate team, and there are a lot of different stakeholders to send this out to. Now, we're getting the hands-on time. I think I'm a little over an hour, barely, like a minute. So now I think we're going to get to the point where we are doing VMware, a learning platform. So hopefully everyone's gotten an email by now. I haven't been checking on the chat. I know Chris has been helping me out here, but I do want to take a moment to at least answer some Q&A too, if people have things. And also, let me see if I can get this. There we go. Also, I will end up walking through some of this myself. So the way we'll do this portion, so I am going to answer some Q&A too right before we jump in. So if you've got questions, I know Chris has answered a couple, but I see one or two here that I can answer too. We're going to go through this at sort of a leisurely pace. We've got 2 hours left in the workshop, so you've got plenty of time to play around and mess with the environment. So we, of course, want you to be able to spend as much time as possible in that. So I'm going to take some time. I'll be walking through a little bit of it, a few steps, and then I will be going and we'll take a short break so that, of course, people can use the bathroom, go get water, coffee, whatever you need. And then we'll keep going through that way. And so that's where, if you're someone that just enjoys going through at your own pace, you don't want, a Tim soundtrack in the back of your head while you're trying to do it, feel free to either throw me on mute or you can always, like I said, exit out the Zoom and work on stuff individually. I will be working through this and I'll be answering any questions about the lab, about Scythe, about any questions you have around purple teaming or anything that I can try to answer. I've got lots of opinions on things, so I'm happy to at least attempt to answer stuff. I don't know everything, but I will do my best to at least give you my answer and thoughts on things. So just to give you sort of here's where we're going to be going for the rest of it. So let's see. All right. So how do you balance the complexity of a scenario? For a red team, we might view something as basic status quo, but in reality, regular TTPs could be viewed as nation state level. Yes, that's a great question. And this is something that I would say on the sort of maturity scale, this is where I like to change things up. You start, and this is the nice thing about a purple team. If you're coming from a red team background, purple teaming can be viewed as that change over time. And this is where typically we'll go in when we're doing purple team activities. Again, depends on the maturity of who we're working with, but I almost always like to start with command line, right? That's something that most red teamers would say, I would never execute on anything on command line these days, right? That's, EDRs will pop me or stop me or all of those things, which might be true, but it's still a starting point. Make sure and validate that those things are still there. If we're not having to do a red team that, maintains stealth and doesn't trigger alerts and that kind of thing, that's the nice thing about purple teaming. You can go and do those loud TTPs, see if they get blocked, see if they get stopped, logged, that kind of thing, and then move from there. That's where I typically then slowly increase the complexity of things, where execution methods are one of my favorite ways to do that. I think that's what that's something that being able to say, all right, we're going to use command line, PowerShell. Then I typically do a short hop to unmanaged PowerShell or Power Pick. But that's something I think that's something that I tend to use. And then Windows API calls tends to be EDRs don't have a bunch of really good telemetry into that right now. And so that tends to be something that doesn't get picked up. So just to give you that sort of longer answer. And by the way, if I don't give you a complete enough answer for you, a thorough enough answer for you, please ask it again. I'll keep going through it. I won't be offended by you asking stuff. So I just wanted to pull that up. All right, let me work on getting up my own instance. So it seems like there's so it looks like a couple of people couldn't get the lab manual up. How is that? Is that a few people? Is that everybody? What's the thought here? And so, yeah, please give me any context you have. We want to make sure unable to start the lab. Okay. Not the actual lab environment. All right. Cool. All right, Chris and I are going to work on this. So with the lab, though, it sounds like at least people are able to get a little bit of thing. All right, connect to the VM. All right, a couple people did get it. They did say you shouldn't have to the username and password. I think they're unicorn. Chris, I'm not logged in yet.
Yes, it's unicorn.
Unicorn.
And,
it should be in the notes section. But as soon as I get myself one of these,
I'm hopping in to see what's going on with some people's manual. Cool. So please be patient. I'm looking into it.
Yeah, thank you. I know that's where, and we can always give you a new entitlement. But yeah, and thanks, Jay, in the chat for posting the username and password. There should be a notes thing, and like I said, I'm getting my own one popped up here. All right, so that we can at least walk through it together. This is always the fun of these. No catalogs to show. All right. So yes, if you are having issues, please let us know. It looks like, yeah, it looks like a couple folks have been posting in. Thanks, Yoni. Yoni's one of our awesome sales reps. So who's also become a bit of a scythe expert himself. So that's something I like to highlight. So if you haven't talked to Yoni yet, Yoni's got a lot. He's a fun story. Let me get my own entitlement here. Let's see. Cool. All right, so let me drag and drop this so you all can see what this looks like. So hopefully everyone got to see that you get this here from events@site.io. You get this quick launch URL that then takes you to this page. When everything pops up, you can hit X on this. You don't have to select a course. And this is going to take a few minutes to populate. And it sounds like we've got a couple of folks, things are working more now for them. Now the manual sometimes will be popped up over here. So that is something that it can hide depending on the size of your screen. I remember the very first time that I did a Purple Team workshop, I was doing it on my 13-inch laptop and George was teaching the class. And so, yeah, it was kind of a cramped screen, but that's where you can move things in and out. So I just want to at least highlight that. So this does take a second to build. So I do want to, it looks like a couple people are working. If you're still having issues, let's see. Let me answer a couple of these. All right. looks like someone mentioned at least that that couldn't find the lab manual, that it got working. We're still having, if you're still having issues with the lab manual, post something in the Q&A allows us to check it off individually, where I know chat is like easier, but it means that we've got to track stuff like as the group. So it makes Chris and I's lives a little easier if you use the Q&A, at least when you're having issues, so we can go and check your stuff individually. So just wanted to at least mention that. All right. So lab access is granted for until the end of the workshop. So you have an hour, 45 minutes left of time. And that's going to be, you'll have access to the workshop, to Scythe, that kind of thing through that time. And then afterward, you'll have to come to another workshop in order to do that. Or of course, you can come talk to someone like Yoni to talk about Scythe as well. So if you want another lab type platform and project, since I do like to give some open source stuff that people can also leverage if you're a student, that kind of thing. Splunk has something called an attack range, and here I will dump it into the chat. And so attack range has it's got some provisioning that it does. So you have to link up like AWS and that kind of thing. So a cloud infrastructure, but it has things like Caldera in it, and you can essentially build something that will run attacks in an environment. It will gather some data for you, and you can use that as sort of a way to use this past it. So we also offer trainings, that kind of thing, where people have access to a lab platform for at least a week, if not longer. So that's just something that I like to highlight. All right, looks like we've got a couple. I just shared it. Oh, I shared it to hosts and panelists. Sorry, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know that no one saw that. But that's the kind of attack range is a good project to work on. There's a ton of like you've probably seen a ton of open source projects that do leverage that have been done. They're great. And then, when you're ready to sort of move past that, that's where, this is what we're trying to show you, sort of those next steps here too. All right. So once you get this, a couple of things that I do want to highlight. One, the manual, of course, you can go back and forth. And that's something that's something you can move through. You'll see you got 27 different steps. There's a bunch of different ways you can go through this. The other thing is, for username and password, there are notes, and apparently the notes are empty here. So I think it is unicorn. Let's check that here. So we will send the Control-Delete. So if you've never pen tested before, that's always one of the first things to try, is the username as the password. So now, we're just going to say that's part of it. And now you all are pen testers. So once you've gotten in, again, that's going to be unicorn. So the username should already be there. And then from here, this is where we can start following this. Now, to get access to Scythe, you're going to open Google Chrome. We're going to just exit out that. And so we do have a couple of things in this environment for you to play around with. So click Scythe to go to Scythe. It'll take us there. Take a second. And of course, we get this little proceed. All of you have your own environment. So that's just something that you shouldn't worry about messing up other people's stuff. And so in this case, we'll proceed. And this is where we're going to be presented with the Scythe interface. So and you can change the sizing of this. If you didn't get an email to VMware, please just shoot us either chat and open up a Q&A and say, hey, I didn't get it, and with your email. That way you don't have to share your email with everybody on chat, and we can get you provisioned one. So all right. If you're having issues, then, if you could open, spam email, is another one, checking your junk, that kind of thing, because like I said, it does look, it's just that single link. It's from events at scythe.io. But if you open up a Q&A with your email, we will go and we can provision you a new one. So thank you. Cool. Or you can send it to chat. Just make sure you're sending it to hosts and panelists instead of the entire chat. So we will get that. And I think, yeah, I think you have 3 hours from when you do provision it. So that's something that, again, sorry for any of the issues that we've had. We're working on it. And it looks like at least the majority of people are able to get in. So yeah, once we've gotten in, you have Scythe. In this case, this is going to be unicorn again in order to log in. And this is going to be our username and password here. So you do have it in the manual. You can log in, and this is where we're going to get our first look at Scythe as a tool. So you've got nothing populated yet. And that's why the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new campaign. So campaign is if you've never seen Scythe before, never heard of it, this is our way of defining a security test. And so you get to you can build a custom one. We have a bunch in the threat catalog already. So if you want to go and play around with these, you can. But I'm going to walk through at least what we have here. I'm happy to answer questions and demonstrate some of what Scythe's done and can do sort of in that extra hours of the chat. But I do want to sort of go through at least follow through exactly what the lab manual talks to, and then we can go from there. So what we're going to do here, since we have a new campaign, we're going to call it our first campaign. You have to give a name to every campaign in Scythe. And beyond that, we do have some things we want to make sure are working. We'll see that our Scythe and all of these are true. HTTPS is here. And then we're going to leave everything else by default, I think. So start night date are empty. And once you're done here, you can click next. Now, once you get to this page, and so I am going to pause after I get through deploying this initial campaign. That way people have time to go through it themselves, and I can help out Chris on anyone that hasn't gotten in yet. But that's something that I just wanted to at least mention, that I'm not going to cruise through everything here and then say good luck. Again, we're going to take this at a slower pace to make sure everybody can get through it. So once we've gotten to this page, we sort of decided whether there was any network connection there on that last page. Remember in the lecture, right, you do need some command and control in order to test some of those living off the land binaries and scripts if you wanted to test those. And so from here, we're going to load some of our modules. And so loading modules, these are just loading your capabilities. And so you can search them too if you want. So we have ARP, we have print screen. So you can click them this way. There's a bunch of different things that you can do, or you can just scroll through it. Just remember to clear these out. The modules are going to be telling your malware what it can do. Now, once you've loaded those, now you can decide on what actions they're going to run. So in this case, we're going to have print screen. We're going to have ARP. We're going to run who am I. And so you can click those. You can create your own custom action here too. So you can click on any of these and build your own. But from here, we also have, you can also drag and drop these. So if you want to mess around with the order of operations, you can do that. And then we're also going to run a MITRE ATT&CK test. And so that's where you'll see over here, we've got what attack techniques. So let's go to the top. Let's pick attack techniques. We're going to go to T1124. So I'm just going to search because I don't want to scroll through it. And you can too. We're going to pick this atomic red team test and we're going to hit add steps. And so you can see that these went and got added here at the end. Now this is unmanaged PowerShell. That's why it's got the U in front of it. But you'll see that when we went through that, it automatically loaded the modules that we needed. So that's sort of the nice part of it. And now that we've done that, we're going to save our all of our changes in our little test here as its own threat. So let's call this one first threat. And then we'll say this is a safe example threat. And simple as that. Now it's done. So, the reason you would do that is if you accidentally, cleared all the steps or, all of your hard work, you can actually now go back to your existing threats and go down. We'll pick our first threat. Oh, there we go. And hit add steps. And now it brings all of those back. And so there's some knowledge transition that you have there just in case you build a test that you want to run later that a teammate wants to run. That's what part of what my team does here at Scythe is we basically take nice, good blog posts and that kind of thing, and somebody will put it into a test. So from here, we now have a campaign that started. Now, to make sure that we're going to replicate this in a way that feels real, right? We need a way to download and execute it. And so that's where you can click download here. You see a bunch of different options. We're going to do this with an executable. So you can download it and you'll see we get this download. We'll go to our, it's going to take a second to finish downloading. We're going to keep it, even though we know, yes, this is potentially going to be a test, and let's execute it. It's as simple as that. And so from that, we now will we'll click done. You'll see we have a host name here. We have a process ID, and this is where we can come in and watch Scythe execute. So that's where you can execute this in your environment. You can also click shell, so you can run things manually if you want. So this is where you have a bunch of options, and you can run these, test things out. That's where if you forget to do something that you put in the automation and you're like, hey, I want to run this manually, you can now also run it, or you can run it manually if you forgot to put it in the automation. And you'll see that, of course, this was run by our local user, but all of it, even that request response, everything is still there so that you have all of the information, regardless of whether it was automated or was manual. So I'm going to give everyone some time to walk through this and, take a break, get some coffee, take a bio break, whatever you want. If you're still having issues with some of the lab environment, please let us know in some of like the chat, either send it to hosts and panelists, like I said, and we will Chris and I are working on trying to get some of that back to you. I am going to kill my camera we'll probably do it for say 5-ish minutes. So that's something that we'll tackle any problems you're having to the best of our ability over the next, like I said, we'll do 5 to 7 minutes to make it, 2:35 is when we'll come back and I'll start walking through the next part. So thanks everyone again for joining us. Sorry about stuff for a couple of the folks that aren't able to get in. We'll work on it. And so let us know if you've got any questions or that kind of thing. Hey everyone, welcome back. I know we're still tackling a couple of folks and just provisioning you some new URLs and that kind of thing if stuff isn't loading. So we are working on that. I know a couple of people talked about lab time. An hour is like we try to give plenty of time for everyone to go through the entire lab manual. So even if you just get access now, you will like have more than enough time to go through all of the steps. So just wanted to mention that. So we don't extend the time, that kind of thing. We do have additional workshops after this one. So that's something that I just wanted to at least highlight, is that these do come out and we do them on a pretty regular basis. So that's just something I want to bring up. All right, so we've run our first campaign. And so that's something. So it looked like for a couple of people that got to the Plex track part, I think there was potentially some issue with the runbooks stuff. So if that's not working, I apologize just for everyone that's dealing with that. If you have gotten to almost the end. So once we've run these campaigns, then the next thing to do is to go through and deal with reports. So that's where being able to go to our dashboard now. So this is where things have changed a little bit. So you can go and download your report here at your dashboard. You're going to be able to download the CSV, HTML, and this we give a little breakdown of everything. The big thing we want is the CSV because this is what we're going to be importing later. So once you download that, you should be good to go. We're going to move on to our next one. And this is showing the command and control that's happening with Wireshark. So if you've never used Wireshark before, this will be fun. This is where you get to see at least some different network traffic. And while everything's going to be encrypted, you have the ability to at least confirm that the connection's happening. So you've got all of your different connections here. You'll see we actually have a little bar on Ethernet 0. And when you click on this, you're going to start to get all of this different information. So one of the things we want to do here is apply a filter to look at the information between our server and our client that we deployed. So that's where we're going to do an IP.adder equals, and this is some Wireshark specific. So we'll do 192.168.0.40. And that's going to be the local IP. So if we execute this, we're already going to get some change, but we don't need all of the different traffic across all of the things happening in the background. So what we're also going to do is add another one for our port 443, which is where we're doing command and control. And so between the two of these, now we have mostly a focus on, unless you're doing more web browsing, it's mostly going to be this Scythe connection. And so what you can do is you can right click on one of the packets here and do a follow TCP stream, and you're going to see all this jumble stuff. And so you'll see back and forth. You're not going to have a lot of information, partially because we do establish an encrypted tunnel for this. And so that's something that regardless, you're not going to be able to really see beyond just knowing that that connection is working. And so that's something that when you're not using necessarily a tool like Scythe, but you're using command and control in general, if you are trying to troubleshoot, this is a great way to do that, to see, hey, why isn't something connecting? Can I watch that and make sure that there is an established connection? Just again, if you're trying to troubleshoot stuff. So one thing with a Wireshark, so I am going to exit out of it because one of the other things about it, and we can always open it back later when we're testing things out. But the idea behind this is that you have done a display filter. Now, Wireshark's still collecting all that information in the background and is loading everything into RAM. And so depending on the resources that you have, and this is something that I learned many years ago when I accidentally opened up a Wireshark capture and I left it overnight, and I couldn't use my computer the next day without rebooting it because basically all of the RAM was taken up by Wireshark storing things into memory. So that has happened, and that's where learn from my mistake, and you don't have to make your own here. And so that's where I'm going to quit without saving, and we can just reopen Wireshark when we want to. So that's something that like I said, it's part of the fun. All right. Now we've talked about and shown how we can do some of this testing. Now let's look at how we can do detections, or at least get that information. So we're going to use Sysmon. So you've heard about Sysmon. You may have tried to deploy it in your environment, or maybe you haven't heard of it and this is your first exposure to it. And so this is that way we can get a ton of different information. So what we're going to do is we're going to install it. You have to right click twice on this command prompt here at the bottom to get this to run as administrator. And then from here, we're going to change to Sysmon directory. So cd Sysmon. So if you've never done command line stuff before, you're about to be a real hacker here. So we're cd change directory. And so this is where you can see exactly where you already were. And now we're changing it to Sysmon. So you don't even have to, just to give you an idea, you can type in C and you can actually tab through all of the different things. So you can use that to cycle through until you get Sysmon and just hit enter, and that's going to bring you to our Sysmon folder. Now, once we're in here, we already have set up for you a configuration file for Sysmon. It always requires a configuration file, and those configuration files have things like what things you want to include and what things you want to exclude. So it's key in that aspect, and that has both of those. It is an entire thing on its own. Like Olaf has the Sysmon modular. And so just to give this an idea, let me open this in a new tab so you can see that there's all these different events that you can go through. It's broken really nicely. Swift on security also has a config that I'll open in a new tab here that I also recommend you check out. So I'll throw these in the chat in case you all want them. So there's Swift on securities. Here's Olaf's. And the cool thing, so for one of the classes I used to give on purple teaming, one of the first times we gave it was going through the Sysmon configuration file, which you can see this is a pretty big thing. And this is Swift on securities is one of the best documented pieces of information about Sysmon. And so you will learn a lot about Windows by going through all of these comments and understanding why these specific things are in here. And that was one of the assignments, was go find something in the comments about Windows that you might not have known before. And so that's something that I know was sort of an interesting thing. There's some really weird things that video drivers do in here. And so this sort of exposes all the complexities of Windows. And so we did get a question about Sysmon for Linux. I'm going to let Chris touch on that whenever he gets a second, to at least give us a little bit of a breakdown on how the things he's gone on to. Because Chris, I know you mentioned you at least talked a little bit about that at the beginning. Let's see whether he might be still troubleshooting a couple of things. So won't put him too much on the spot yet. But once we're in here, so since we've already got the sysmon config.xml loaded, we are going to install it. And so that's what we have here. We do sysmon 64, and you can tab complete that stuff. -I is install, and now it's going to be the actual XML file. So again, you can start tabbing through stuff, and that's where autocomplete is your friend. And tab 3 times, we have sysmon config.xml, and we hit enter. It's going to give us this whole rundown, and it says it started. So we're good to go. Sysmon is installed, and now you don't have to do anything else. You can close this administrator command prompt, and we are good to go. Now let's go and view some of these sysmon logs. So what we can do is we're going to minimize our Scythe client here. We have this event viewer, which we're going to run as administrator. So you have to right click again twice. And so it's going to pop up this really nice little view for us. All right. And so once you get this, if you've never gone through the event viewer before, it's kind of I'm pretty sure some of the stuff is intentionally built so it's not super user friendly, so you don't mess with too much stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to navigate through those applications and service logs. So we're going to expand that. We're going to expand Microsoft, Windows, and then we're going to get this huge list. And now we get to go and find Sysmon in this list. So we'll go down here. All right, here is Sysmon. So we're going to click on that, open it up. We get this nice operational log, and you'll see we have all of these events. And so that's the big thing with Sysmon is you have these event IDs. Now, if you haven't ever used it before, you can see, click on them and you'll get some details. You'll see, oh, a network connection has been detected. That is because our Scythe program is still, after it ran all of that automation, it's still calling back and forth. So if we go into our first campaign here, it's still active. So it's still doing check-ins every 5 seconds. And let's come into the shell and let's run something again. Let's run Who Am I and see what happens. So, all right, we got a response there. So now let's go back to our Sysmon and see if we got anything new. So we can come in here, we can hit refresh, and we got a couple of other things. We have this new event ID, it's event ID 1, which is process creation. Well, if you remember back to the lecture, process creation and command line execution or command execution are two of the big things that we want to detect on. And this is why. So let's scroll down through these details and you'll see, hey, look at that. It's running Who Am I? All right. And then we have on the command line that it was run with Who Am I? We have the directory that it was run out of, the user. You can see how all this information, and not just that, check this out. We have a MITRE ATT&CK ID associated with this. So all that stuff is great for your reporting. And again, we don't have any special EDR or anything on this right now. This is just installing Sysmon with Olaf's configuration that helps do some of that mapping to MITRE ATT&CK for you. So that's one of the nice things about this is you do have this level of information. Now you do get all of these other ones as well. So that's where you do have to sort this. And it's like, okay, Chrome's just doing some stuff here. Like this is going to be potentially noise that we're going to have to either filter out or figure out how to do. And so trying to figure out all of these things, like in this case, you'll see that we're going to capture all sorts of stuff that's happening in the background too. And this is why some people don't like using Sysmon, because it gives you so much information. But again, like anything, it does take on some tuning and things like that. So that's where I just want to mention that this is what's cool about it, is you get to see all of this. And if you want to make it easier on you as you're doing this, clear the log, and then you can come and execute other things, and you're going to have all of that stuff at the top. All right. Now that we've got that, what we're going to do is we're going to do an entire attack chain. So we're going to go back to Scythe, where what we're going to type here is controller -- shutdown. And so this is just going to terminate it. You can also terminate the campaign and build another one if you want. But that's the other thing. If you want replayability, instead of just if you terminate it, you can't do this. But if you do that individual shutdown, now we want to replay, we'll just run it again. All right, sorry about that. Quick mute. All right, so once we have executed that again, what we're going to come in here is we'll go back to see our overall campaign. We have a second connection now that's active. And so we're going to watch this one run. And then what we're going to do is we're going to check our logs. And so I'm going to wait a second. I see I've got a couple questions. I'm here for the Scythe box. Can I log in via Unicorn as admin? So you should, that's what Unicorn is the username password. So if you are an administrative user within Scythe, that shouldn't be an issue. And yes, there's a great point that Sysmon is not a one-hit wonder. You still need to correlate with additional logs from other sources. And that's exactly right. That's something that is, that's a big thing, is that it does require tuning it, having stuff in that. Let's see, on the host login page, So, right, for that, I think Chris is working through stuff. Oh, when you click next, why doesn't it take you to the top of the next page? Yes, that's a great point on the UI stuff. I will pass that on. Sweet. And then let's see. All right, just taking a pause to answer questions as people are doing it. So now after we've executed all of these, now let's go back into our sysmon. And this was after it. And let's refresh it. And I'm going to make this easy by I want to sort by event ID. And so I want these event ID ones, because this is where you're going to get specific things. Again, we have user execution, this rule name. So you've got technique IDs. You can click here to all of the ones that are event ID 1. So, and we can refresh it too to see if there's anything new. And this is where, again, we've got, I think, who am I again? And this is going to allow you to start checking things out. And so we can see like, what do we have? We've got a bunch of network connections. We've got a process that's terminated. So that's new. That's probably from where we killed our previous tests. We have files that are created. So in this case, we've got PowerShell executing, and not just that, it looks like, all right, we've got a PowerShell script. And in this case, I'm guessing it's the unmanaged PowerShell. So there's a bunch of stuff you can see here. We've got some different registry keys that are being messed with. So that's the kind of cool thing about this, is you can go through and see exactly what sysmon can see that you executed. You have that attacker viewpoint here, as well as sysmon in this case, to see exactly what you can detect. And that's where having things like, there's another project called Detection Lab, which is stood up, and Splunk, the Splunk attack range takes advantage of some of those types of things, where you have this basically heavily logged environment, so that when you execute anything as an attacker or with a test tool, you get all of the information on what artifacts were created, things like that, so that you have the ability to essentially do that and see, all right, did I know everything that was going to happen? And that's where, if you're a red teamer and you're using this a tool like Scythe, or even just a tool like Detection Lab, figuring out, hey, do I know all of the things that happen when I execute this command? Do I know all the places where I'm putting artifacts on a host? This is a great way to go through and do that. And it takes time, and especially when you're just doing this one by one. And so there's different ways too. Like I mentioned, some of those different execution methods that you can leverage are going to allow you to test out what are those sysmon artifacts or Windows event IDs, as it was already mentioned. All right, so with that, now let's keep rolling. So from here, we can go back. We can also say we're going to, this one finished. So I'm going to terminate this campaign. And the way that, there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can either go back straight to the dashboard. Actually, this is probably the easiest way, and click on first campaign, click our little thing here. We've got our 3 buttons, and then I'm going to hit terminate. So this will shut everything down. Make sure that we're not going to get any more logs or anything from it. You can verify this. There's a way that you, of course, checking in Wireshark. You can also check in here that there's not this sysmon event ID 3 that's continually being put out by Scythe, this Scythe client. So you can check all of that. I'm just going to clear it without saving. And we'll go on to what's next. So this is talking about the tracking with PlexTrack. So what we can do here is we can click on PlexTrack and it'll take us there. I think some people mentioned that at least some of the runbook stuff, it looked like there was a slight issue with the runbooks licensing. So we'll get that taken care of. But jumping ahead, just so that we continue to work on this. So let's jump into PlexTrack here. So this one does require email. I already have a nice suggestion. And of course, unicorns are our sort of mascot at Scythe. In case you can couldn't pick that up. And you'll see we've already got a couple of things here that you can see sort of the tracking and some of those different assessments that you can do. So you can sort of see about what PlexTrack has to offer. Again, I think some of the runbook stuff, we're still getting all of that fixed, but let's go ahead and jump to, oh, sorry. All right, so there was no run books because of the licensing, I think. So this part might be, we might need to skip over this. So let's talk about cyber threat intelligence. So part of this is leveraging something like MITRE ATT&CK, right? So if you haven't seen ATT&CK, let's go to it. So in this case, we're going to talk about Conti. We also have, this was an example of Orange Worm, and you can see here that you can actually go through the entire site and see, all right, let's go see if we can find Conti. And it's like, oh, Conti's not in here. It's probably because it's not a group. Oftentimes it is been a specific, it's a specific software, I'm like pretty sure. And so it's going to be under software instead. And so MITRE ATT&CK also has, here we go, ransomware as a service. And so you can see all of these different techniques that have been used. You have these different technique IDs that you can leverage. And then of course, like what specific groups, if they have used this. So this is where you can have some interesting overlap between groups and the software they use. So you can, some groups, of course, are going to use multiple types of software, and they're going to be able, we're going to be able to leverage all of those different techniques. So that's just something. You can also use the attack navigator layer view here to see and load up all of those different techniques. So kind of a cool thing you can do, just like to highlight some of that. Jump back to our lab here. And so that's where with Conti, there's a bunch of different things that we have. There's tons of information because it is widely used. The playbook actually got leaked for it. And so there's been a lot of information around how the operators actually use things, tooling and what commands that they run. And so what we want to do is, of course, leverage those to build an adversary emulation. So you can either work through the cyber threat intelligence yourself, or you can, of course, leverage what we've already done. And so I'm going to suggest, of course, leveraging what we've already done. And let's go ahead and make this Conti. So I think we'll leave everything as is. And the big thing here is being able to take existing threats, and then we're going to preload it with Conti. So you'll see we have our DFIR report here that goes into a ton of detail on it. They have timestamps. Like, it is an awesome project. I highly recommend checking it out. And then you're going to see, instead of building things out piecemeal, we have this many step project that's already executing. And so this is the type of thing that you can modify it if you want, play around. I'm going to hit start campaign. And what we can do, there's a couple of different things that we can do here. We can still either download this as an exe, or we can do this with some of our low blast techniques, which is going to be run DLL 32. So we're going to take this DLL, we're going to download the Scythe client here, and so you'll see that we downloaded DLL this time. So what we're going to do, we have this entry point function name, which is critical when we are running using the lulbin techniques. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pull up a command prompt. You don't need to be a privileged user. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to change my directory to downloads just so I'm exactly where that DLL is. And so here's the command you run. So this is also, of course, in the chat here on step or in the workbook on step 9, is that it's run dll32.exe. This can be run from anywhere on Windows. It is something that is used. That's why it's a living off the land, is that this is something that Microsoft and other vendors use in the background as part of what they're testing. And so there we can start typing a C, hit tab. Like I said, autocomplete your friend. And then here's the big thing that gets people tripped up, even if they've done this kind of stuff before, including myself, is that you have a comma, and then you have the entry point function name. So you're giving it the library, and then, you know, what book, what chapter to start on. And so you can hit comma here, and then type absolute client main, which is this entry point function name. And we'll hit enter. And then we're going to get our execution. And so it's going to take it a second. It's going to call back. But that's how we do some of those lull-in techniques, is you have this execution that way. So that can be something that's much harder to detect. You click on unicorn and you can watch this run again. So I do want to take some time, before we go into some of the detection engineering stuff, let everybody get here. And I know we're still working with a couple of folks. So again, sorry for any of the lab issues. For hopefully it sounds like it's been a couple people. We're trying to work through it, but hopefully most folks are able to at least get through parts of the lab. So with that, I will answer some questions. I'm going to help Chris out some, and we will go from there. So we'll give it probably another 8 minutes. So 3:10 is when I'll come back on video and have a soundtrack again. I will be working on trying to tackle a couple of the Q&A and any lab issues people are having. Thanks. All right. So you can hopefully see here, of course, the that we have this, we've got our README popped up here. So that's the nice thing about running something like Scythe. The good news is this is all running this within, of course, your VM, but also it's running it within sort of its own environment. And so you can look through the tests and see that. So let's go back to the threat catalog really quickly just to dive into that, because that's something that's kind of cool, is how we do this ransomware emulation. So people can run this in production if they want. So we can go down here and see that what we're doing is we're creating the directory that we're essentially running that ransomware emulation out of. So we're creating all of the files that we're going to ransom. We're compressing them up. So all of the things you would expect from ransomware that's doing that double extortion. And then we upload it to the Scythe server. So this is a way that you're not stealing any data that's something that you wouldn't be able to, that is real business data. This is all this randomly created stuff. And that way, that's the nice thing, is that you don't have to steal your own data without and potentially worry about how that would, if you were staging something that was legitimate. So you can change this, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But the idea behind this is that you can rerun this over and over again, so that it is, it mentions that, hey, this does encrypt it, but it's encrypting the folder that we created earlier. It is downloading a little readme.txt, which is the thing that popped up that had that ransom note, and then it pops it up in Notepad. So that's with Notepad. So that's one of the cool things about it, is that it looks like a real ransomware payload, of course, without that impact. And so we can rerun that over and over and over again to make sure that we're building detections around it. So that's where, let's talk a little bit about that. So we're going to go into Elastic, which is Kibana, if you've never used that before. So in order to do this, we are going to have to restart winlogbeat. So this is where we're going to come, this was our run DLL 32. So I'm going to pop this up really quickly, and we need an administrator one. So I'm going to hit X. We're going to right click on this twice. And what we're going to do is type services.msc. And this will pop up. You'll get another pop up here that brings up all of the Windows services. So we can make this bigger. And the one big thing is we need to scroll down to winlogbeat. And so this is something that, in order to take advantage of, let's see, hopefully I didn't scroll past it already. There it is, right towards the bottom, almost all the way to the bottom. And so what we're going to do is we're going to right click this, and we're going to hit restart. And so it'll take a second. And beats are essentially the way that Elastic is getting information from endpoints. And so we've installed all of that for you, so you don't have to do it on your own. So if you go through that process of messing with the ELK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, where Elasticsearch is essentially the database, Kibana is our Logstash, is the way that transportation happens between different things. And then we have Kibana is our interface. And so that's where we're essentially making sure that our data is kind of come in, because this log beat is grabbing Windows logs, sending it over to Kibana. So that's why we just went through that whole process. And now I'm going to exit out of both of these. And now we are in Elastic. Now, in Kibana. So Elastic is the company, and we've clicked on Kibana to get here. Now, you can click on some of these, and for some reason, some of the images aren't loading. So I'll walk you through it directly. If you've never used this before, your little hamburger menu here is going to be the home to everything. Now, this is and can be an EDR. There are lots of paid versions of Elastic that essentially can balloon it and allow you to do all sorts of things with it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to Discover, and under Discover, you have your log source here. And so Mordor was a project by Roberto Rodriguez and a couple of other people that had some malicious data that they created. So this is sort of a backup, although you're going to have to increase the timeline to like 3 years for that. So what we want to do is move to winlog beat here. And that's where now we're going to have all of these events. So that's the first big thing you want to do is change your data source. And this is going to have, you'll see all of these are different things here. And so you can see that we start to have all of these events. So I'm going to get rid of a couple of these, and you can scroll through these to see what the event has. Now, searching through the event is going to be our big thing. And so that's where we already talked about switching this. And for some reason, yeah, my browser starts with them and then doesn't. We'll have to look at that. But what we want to look at is like Mimikatz, for instance. So we'll see, all right, is there lsas.exe, right? That's something that gets used. All right, there was nothing matching R. And so this is where, all right, looks like we need to extend our timeline. So did we ever run Mimikatz? We'll go to 30 minutes ago. And so I didn't as part of this campaign because I ran it as a user. However, if you run the Conti test as an administrator, it does run Mimikatz. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this as administrator. And maybe you already did this, but that's where I'm going to, we'll do CD. Oh, all right. Windows, actually, we will get there. Users. All right. Unicorn downloads. All right. So a little bit of command line foo there. And then we're going to do that run DLL32. Same thing as before, comma, and then we'll do absolute client main. And so while this is running in the background, let's look for some other stuff. What about who am I, right? That was something that we saw earlier. So who am I.exe. And so we can start looking and hey, look at that. We've got who am I. And so this is where you can start to build out. And this is, you can see all of those different parts of that event that we brought in. So you'll see that, all right, we got this with sysmon, right? And we have hashes that we can work off. We have process ID fields, that kind of thing. And you can see over here on the left, all of those different fields that you can leverage as part of what you're trying to do for your detection. So you have event IDs, things like that. So you can either, again, leverage things like sysmon's event IDs to look for anything that is event ID 1. If you're looking for those specific like process create, and then you could even filter in on things like the Windows command line. So that's where you can start broad, like we mentioned before, and then add filters that, again, continually whittle down the amount of information that we're looking at so that we can figure out what a good detection would be. All right, so let's keep going through this and you'll see we've got this detection opportunity on who am I. So we can, instead of just searching for who am I.exe, we can look for the process name. So this is where a process name is going to get you a whole lot more. It's better to search this than to just search who am I itself. So we've got a couple of different counts here. We can go and look at those individually. And so this is how we can start to, again, look at all the different ways that sites or any other tool you're using to execute some of these payloads are going to give you this data to work off of. Same as we've gone through our purple team process. All right, so with that, I know a couple of folks have still had some issues. And yes, it is unicorn for the people that are asking about logins. And then that's just something that, you have free play here. That's what, as somebody mentioned, be careful when you're running some of the tests so you don't accidentally weaponize them in your environment. But by default, all of the tests are meant to be safe. So that's just something that I do want to highlight. Play around with Scythe. I'm happy to answer questions. Again, apologies for some of the challenges that people have had with the lab environment. Sometimes we have had instances where people's their organizational policy has meant that they couldn't reach VMware Learning Platform or things couldn't load within it. So I know we're trying to work through that, and Chris has done some of that on the back end. But thanks everybody again for coming. I will be hanging around here, happy to answer as many questions as I can. And just know that that's something that really appreciate you all coming and sharing your time with us on a Friday. So with that, like I said, I'm here. Chris is here, and happy to try and answer what we can. As far as shutting down once you're done, exiting out of the page is all you need to do. So that's where, again, everyone's stuff will shut down here at the top of the hour. So hope a bunch of people did get to walk through this. If you did have issues, really sorry about that. We'll help out while we can for the rest of the time today. And then we'll, of course, we do run these on a regular basis. And so you'll be able to leverage these again. I know we've had a couple of people that have taken these multiple times. So really appreciate everybody showing up. And I know your Friday afternoon if you're in the States. And I know we had some folks from all over the world here. So thanks for sharing your time with us. Slide deck will be available probably tomorrow. Today, I typically send it over to our marketing team to put out here shortly, but that's something that I think they upload it and then they end up tweeting it out. So if you don't follow the Scythe.io Twitter account, it should be there. So Chris, when you get a second, I do want to address the whether about Sysmon for Linux. Let's see if you had anything else to say on it. Oh, there we go.
Right. Scrambling with VMware learning platform. Too many gremlins wherever their data center is. Yeah, with not VMware, Linux Sysmon. I'm still diving into it some, but it gives you some like basic detection opportunities and things that you don't normally get just out of the box with Linux. So we're looking at some of those common things, like command line parameters, processes, target files, things like this. So I'm still diving into it, but it's definitely something of interest if you're familiar with Sysmon at all, or if you need to, look at trying to replicate what an EDR might look like. You can also deploy it that way to see how, working with an EDR might look like on Linux. It's one of those things where we talk about, every environment's unique. Every environment's going to have different log sources. Every environment is going to have different solutions in it. So it's always hard to do training because, there's going to be different language sets and things like this. But if you have an understanding of the actual logging types that, like you mentioned earlier with attack, with how they actually say, okay, for the detection of this, you're going to look for process creation. So once you start understanding these data sources, you can go into any environment and then you can map it to those capabilities in that environment. So you say, okay, is that getting sent to the SIM? Where's process creation? It might be event 4688. It could be Sysmon 1. It could be in a CrowdStrike or a Carbon Black. So it just depends. But as long as you go through and you start understanding these different data points that like attack references or in the detect framework, then you can map that to any environment. And so that's when we're going through training on detection. It's one of those things of just thinking about these different data sources, not necessarily getting hung up on, oh, this syntax is different than the syntax I use in Splunk compared to Elk. Don't get hung up on that. You can adapt to that. It's really conceptually understanding the data sources.
Yep. Always what it comes back to. Where do you get your data? What do you do with it?
I always love, there's like a meme. I think it's like a Peter Griffin meme. And he's like holding like a big log on his shoulder. And it's like threat hunters showing up saying, show me your logs.
Got another question for you. How are the logs from sysmon on Linux looking? Is it more readable than the outcomes of audit.d, which have to be combined with audit ID?
Yes, I think there's actually a good setup that I've been using. I'll have to go back through. As I've been going through, I've been documenting stuff, but there's a certain setup. At least I'm using like a certain parser that is an add-on to Splunk. So, if you're sending it to a different sim, I don't know how parsing would be then, but right now with the Splunk add-ons, it's looking pretty nice.
Good questions. Yeah, Chris is the person to ask about if you've got like detection engineering stuff that you've got questions. I mean, he's our detection engineer extraordinaire here. So feel free. You've got us for another half hour. So if you've got questions around that, adversary emulation, red teaming, that kind of stuff, always happy to answer any questions people have. So keep them coming. Appreciate the engagement. It's always fun to get some of these. I'll scroll back to see. I know we had some questions around a couple different things. Let's see. Yeah, otherwise we can just talk about, I don't know. There wasn't a 0-day drop this week, so, and by me saying that, I've doomed us all. You're muted, man.
I said, yeah, it's gonna hit on like 5 o'clock on Friday.
Yeah, we've got an hour and a half until it drops. Yeah, that is what I do. I mean, I do come from a red team background, so that's sort of I jinx everything.
I mean, let's see. CISA released that Citrix has security updates for hypervisor.
Okay.
Could be interesting vulnerabilities there. We don't know yet.
I was about to say Felina got like at first it was like a small set of stuff, and then sort of an avalanche as people like export it more and more, that it turns out that Microsoft diagnostic tools got a lot of interesting things we can do with it. That's where Lulbass, if you have never heard of that, so let's do that here. Lulbass project. This is critical. If you are in a Windows environment, they also have GTFO bins is for Linux. So just where there is a collection of these. And then I think they now have one that's WTF bins, which is for false positive generating basically normal programs. Like I think Skype runs Who Am I whenever like you boot it up or something like that. So that's the kind of stuff where it is legitimate, but it's one of those things that it does very adversarial looking things. And so going through any of these, as Chris mentioned, you can click on any of them. They give you a breakdown. They show you examples of how you can test these. And then they give you all of these Sigma techniques.
All right. Looks like Tim's actually experiencing a power outage apparently. So that's why he's kind of, at least on my screen, frozen. I don't know what he looks like for everyone else. But someone asked, what's the most advanced attack obfuscation technique that you've tested and was not detected by a client? Most advanced. I don't know. That'd be hard to like pin down. But what I'll say is one of the common things that a lot of people don't alert on that should is unmanaged PowerShell. That's not necessarily the most advanced, but it's definitely one of those ones that people are missing and definitely need to look into. And let me see, NSA actually released some guidance the other day on monitoring PowerShell. So that's definitely an area to look into. It was one of those things where adversaries were heavy on PowerShell for a while, kind of left it because it got started getting looked at so much, and now moved back to it, and definitely has the capability to run unmanaged PowerShell.
Did you talk about invoke obfuscation? Sorry, my power just died here, folks. So that was a fun cutoff in the middle of an answer. So yeah, I'm calling in from my phone now, but I saw something about obfuscation techniques.
Yeah, invoke obfuscation. What is that? Is that Daniel Bohannon, I think?
Yep. He was the one that released the initial research around it after seeing some financial threat actors that were camel casing some of their different commands, because PowerShell doesn't care. It's not case sensitive in a bunch of those. However, detections were being written that were case sensitive. And so that was where they were able to, some threat actors exploited that. And basically, he takes advantage in the invoke obfuscation project of all of the things you can do with PowerShell, because it's a real programming language, and you can essentially do all these obfuscated things like make variables a single character and essentially string together an array of characters that are all things that make up your command. And so if you don't have script block logging enabled in your environment, you are not going to have the minimize command, and you're going to have to try and either use the revoke obfuscation project that he created, or you're going to have to try and do it by hand. But that's two things that you probably don't want to have to do sort of when you've found one of those commands.
So interesting enough, a pro tip that you can actually do is if you have the obfuscated command and you don't know how to deobfuscate it, you can actually just, if you have like a jump box that's not connected to the internet and stuff, you potentially can run that command in there if you have the login enabled, and then get the output that way.
Yep. And Pratik, to your question, right now you can put in obfuscated commands, and you can put in scripts. Like our unmanaged PowerShell allows you to leverage scripts, and so you could essentially tie some of that stuff in, like invoke obfuscation as part of it. But we do have a couple of other things sort of coming up to help do more, we'll say, dynamic encoding as part of that regular build process. So the question was around, can you have, is there some automation insight around obfuscation techniques and that kind of thing, or do you have to load them manually? So you can load them manually. There are some things that we can do to automate some of that. We also have an automation language. And so, like, unfortunately, I can't show some of that right now because my power is still not back, but we do have the capability to essentially tie the output of one command into the next. And so you can have like variables. And so the way to do that is you would essentially assign the PowerShell command you want to a one variable, and then you could essentially pass that in as a argument to another one. So you could do obfuscation that way. And for anyone that's interested, SpectreOps actually released their Adversary Tactics PowerShell course that I took it back in 2017 and spent $4,000 on it. It was a great class then, so no complaints there. But they, as somebody mentioned in the comments, they have mentioned that most red teams now are focused on C# than PowerShell. And I would even go beyond that, in that a lot of red teams are actually abandoning C# now, or trying to do other things. And so Chris just linked it. It's free training, 4 days. It has labs. And of course, if the labs only require you have a Windows environment to test out. But it's great training. SpectreOps does come out with some really good stuff. So highly recommend checking it out. You can go download it. I always recommend it to any new person on our team here at Scythe. Go and work through that, because while PowerShell is something red teamers are moving away from, adversaries very much still leverage it extremely heavily. There's only a few that really don't use it. So that's where I'd say PowerShell logging and some of that, while it's gotten better, is not often fine-tuned in most environments, which is why using things like unmanaged PowerShell and some of those obfuscation things can really throw people off, even in modern environments with EDR and all of that in play.
Yeah, it's one of those things to me from a detection side. Sometimes like how you get the C# execution, like that can actually like stand out like really well. But then like, PowerShell strings, like they can just start blending into an environment depending upon the environment pretty well.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a little bit more interesting. And that's where changing those execution methods, though, depending on what you're doing, is always a good thing, because it does require correlating those different events. Not that many places do implement syslog. We're big fans of it, but because it's got so much noise potentially associated with it, that's why some environments, a lot of enterprises have not installed it and put it in. They rely on the telemetry that's gathered by their EDRs, things like that, which isn't bad, but it does mean that you're relying on the EDR to do some of that correlation for you, which is fine as long as you can verify that it's doing that as you would expect. And I think that's the really big thing that we've seen with people using tools like Scythe, is using it to verify and sort of build that confidence in their ability to spot and defend against adversary behavior in their environment.
Yeah, 100%. Even just doing something like getting some basic baseline test of like, looking at do we have name pipe creation? Does our EDR do that or not? There's just a bunch of different things that validating what you can actually even just log before you dive into detection is a huge thing of what your EDR is capable of.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that's where the EDR is being able to take advantage of some of their like advanced analytics. And I know everyone hates hearing AI ML, but right, that's the big thing with machine learning, is you need data. And if you feed it bad data, junk data, or not enough data, it can be a huge issue and can really impact its ability to perform. So regardless of how much buy-in you have to those technologies, being able to at least give it the information it needs to potentially learn more about environments is really critical. So everything relies on data. It really does.
Also,
which is why. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's one of those areas too. I think Jake talks about it some, where it's like adversaries will get their hands on your tools. Like they'll learn what EDR you have, then they'll procure that EDR, they'll test it, and then they might not even have to use a bypass for that EDR. They're just going to run things that they know don't cause alerts for an out of the box deployment. And that's where if you actually go out and you test and you build out tailored alerts for your environment, now you have like a bunch of like detection landmines that you've deployed that they might hit, so you can detect them earlier.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's why we really try and focus on, like, you don't have to be, a Chris level detection engineer in order to do all of that. Chris has been nice enough to submit a lot of stuff to Sigma, and Sigma has all of these rules that you can leverage in order to put those tripwires in. So adversaries are then having to figure out the out of the box EDR and Sigma rules. And most of the time, Sigma rules also do require some tuning. So having a framework an execution framework that allows you to test and tune those tools so you can run it over and over again, it's gonna be really, really hard for an adversary to be able to basically write tests that are gonna go around both of those. It would be very interesting to see a tuned Sigma database as well as a tuned EDR like that. I'm pretty sure we'll catch probably the majority of adversaries. I would say a very high percentage of them would get logged if not detected in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to really devote research time if like you're gonna do an EDR bypass. Like that's not something your average threats are really going out and trying to get. So as long as you can really get that EDR tuned in, then you're gonna be pretty solid against most threats. And then obviously you can try to get to that next level when what happens when they do unhook an EDR or something like that. But definitely having that base level of tuning and verification that we are catching those procedures that we're seeing day in and day out, especially from like ransomware actors. Like they have some solid procedures that they hit on. So most threats are definitely can be addressed just with some EDR tuning, without you having to worry about like what if they bypass. Like you're getting really high up there when you talk about threats that are actually going out and trying to bypass EDRs.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is like sometimes it can feel, if you follow enough people on Twitter, like every control can instantly be bypassed by really good red teamers. But again, remember that expertise is not widely scaled. It really isn't. And those techniques don't even necessarily scale. I talk a little bit about this in a presentation I've given a couple of times now called Automating Adaptive Adversaries. And really that is about scale that some of these adversaries use. And so they're able to take some certain techniques and essentially scale them that other threat actors aren't, is sort of the big difference. And so if you have someone that is a more sophisticated threat actor, again, most of the time, I mean, even nation states, they're targeting more than one system these days. They're targeting more than one organization. And so they have to have some amount of scale, whether it's giving it to 10 different operators, but those operators have to be able to leverage those techniques. And so if it is something that is overly complicated, then that's going to increase the chance of mistakes of that technique. And so depending on whether they are trying to maintain stealth or something like that, they may not use it unless it's a guarantee. So that's just something I like to always bring up, because adversaries always seem like this, like, amorphous blob of expertise, and they can just hop over everything, but that's not necessarily true. There's a few adversaries that can do that, but they have very specific targets, and I would probably venture a guess that most people on this call do not fall within one of those targets. So that's the kind of thing that I think for the 99.9% of us that are dealing with the rest of the adversaries, using some of these things like Sigma rules, a framework for testing the detections that you have in place is really critical. And especially if you have detections that are built on top of other detections, that's something you've got to be really careful about. You have to make sure and retest anytime you push out a change, because if anything in that chain breaks, one of the big things I think, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong here, was whenever event IDs or anything changes, and not necessarily the event ID itself, but the information and how it's parsed. I know Microsoft sometimes has updated the fields, and that has meant that it breaks people's detections and they don't know it, which is terrible, That's the worst possible thing, is you thinking, hey, I've got this thing, but someone pushed a change and actually none of your detections work because they're not parsing out the events correctly. And
yeah,
so
you can have that, or the platform can get updated and then your search query doesn't work anymore. And it's not because of the parsing, it's just like they changed the way the search query works in like the EDR. So just having that validation. We did get one question though. Let me see. It was how often do you conduct purple teaming engagements within your org?
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, I would say it depends. I mean, my feeling, and I know Chris, you've got some opinions on this too, is that more and more we're going to see internal teams become purple teams, even if they're not necessarily called a purple team. But essentially, this is part of your how organizations are evolving, is that there's too many things to defend against. So you have to pick, right? You have to pick and choose what adversaries, you have to pick and choose where to put your budget. And the way to inform that is by having more of this purple team mentality, even if you don't follow the exact framework we've walked through here. And so I think from that standpoint, we've seen more organizations that are doing them like a quarterly cadence. But I think that's only going to continue to increase. And we're going to hit a point where people are essentially like, that is how they do threat hunting. That is how they do detection engineering. All of that essentially would fall under how we're talking about purple team exercises here. And that would be more day to day. Like, I have talked to some organizations that have like a senior manager for purple teaming already. Like, they are very much are dedicating people, resources. Most big tech companies are doing that already. And so they have dedicated purple teams. Now, they're big enough that they can have a blue team, red team, a purple team. But I think we are going to see more and more of every business shifts to a purple model. And here I'll say my final thing, and then I'll let you give your opinion, Chris. Is I think that part of it is I think it's better to have less detections that you can validate than more detections that you don't know if they actually work. And that's I think where purple teaming helps you create, like, start with that foundation of confidence and knowing of what's working.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think it really comes down to hunting what evil looks like in your environment and figuring that out. And that's what you're trying to scope down to. Because if you just deploy a bunch of rules, you're going to have a bunch of false positives. Then you're going to need to figure out how you're going to address all these rules and stuff like that. So it really allows you to scope down. But I mean, to me, your tempo is going to be based upon your resources. So if you actually have dedicated resources, you can be doing one a week. If you don't have dedicated resources, it might be something that you do monthly. So it just kind of depends. And then also too, you can do more like atomic type tests if necessary. So if you see that what your email gateway is blocking, if you see like an uncommon way that it's functioning, zip to link file, execute and run DLL, like we did that in one of our emulations. But if you see something that isn't out there yet and known, you can actually go ahead and say, hey, we need to test like these 4 steps chained together to see, can we detect this type of activity in our environment if this actor who's sending us stuff, if it gets past the email gateway. So that could just be a little 1-day purple team exercise with 4 procedures. So it just depends, like I said, on your resources of how many resources can you actually dedicate to the process. But to your talking point, I mean, to me, everyone's part of the same team, whether it's purple, blue, whatever you want to call it. Because at the end of the day, everyone's there to defend whatever organization you're employed by. So it's always one of those things of just having that constant like cat and mouse type of mentality. I always equate it to, it's like a scrimmage. So if you ever played sports, you scrimmage against each other, even though you're on the same team. And then that way, when the actual opponent shows up, you're ready to play ball, so to speak. So that's the way I like to think of purple teaming, is that we want to get as many scrimmages as we can to make sure that we're up to snuff and that we're able to defend of what we've seen our adversaries do. It's just the same thing. If you play soccer or football or basketball or anything, all of the coaches, they go in and they look at film of the other team and they study their opponent. And so that's one of the big things that we need to do from a cyber defense is we need to look and we need to study our opponents, what techniques and procedures they're using, and then making sure that we're ready for those when they come up.
I like the comparisons. I think they're really good.
Someone asked, how do you address rules which have more benign positives than false positives? More benign positives than false positives. Kind of thrown off by that, because isn't a benign positive a false positive? I don't know.
And that's what I would say. Like, I mean, false positives for
I mean,
things
obviously,
that are
false
going to have a lot of
positives.
false positives are going to be the lull bins, right? Like that's going to be the big thing. And so that's anything that has like legitimate use cases or is just widely used in your environment is going to be it's going to require potentially a lot of tuning. I mean, we've seen some weird things in environments and then people go and track them down and it's like, oh yeah, they just have a legacy piece of software that was written 20 years ago. They've been supporting it ever since because it still works. And that impacts their ability to write detections around specific other techniques. And so that's something that, I mean, it's why detection engineering is a challenge and requires a lot of extra resources, is being able to figure out and potentially be creative, because you may have to create a set of rules that is going to be extremely unique to your environment, right? And that's the challenge, is that yes, the easy things to detect and block on are things that you can deal with relatively quickly. But when you start getting into the actual details of some of those ones that do require more tuning, which is why we've seen more adversaries turn towards those, is that it does take time. It does take effort. I mean, we've spent 8 hours before with someone going through 3 or 4 different lull bass techniques. And it's just fine tuning it for their environment. It's hunting through those things and figuring out, how do we make this, as good of a detection as possible, also knowing that it's not going to be perfect, right? Those are really challenging because, yeah, you have to figure out what is that balance between a wide enough net that it will capture things that you may have to diagnose some false positives. But if it's too specific, it means that adversaries will be able to get by it easily. So yeah, that's I mean, a good question, and I mean it's tough. So good.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Just try to look for what you can do in your environment. It's tough though, like, right? Because sometimes like an EDR vendor, they might have an alert and they don't actually tell you the alert logic, so then you can't tune it. But some EDR vendors, they let you see the alert, so then you can actually take that alert, and if you have too many false positives, you can say like, oh well, it's from this one machine. It's an acceptable risk that we can tune out that one machine, and at least we still have coverage for that over all the other machines in our environment. Or it could be a user or a parent process, or different target files. There's all sorts of different stuff that you can start tuning for your environment the way it's set up.
Appreciate all the good questions. It's always fun to have these. InfoSec, and adversary emulation, all that stuff keeps us on our toes, right? And adversaries come out with new things. I mean, we've seen that a lot of times now adversaries are chaining together like execution methods, right? Where you'll have an LNK file that calls PowerShell, that calls something else, and you have like 4 different things that it's all trying to trigger. And part of that is because they're trying to disassociate the events from each other, right? That's why process injection and process hollowing and some of those things are such a big deal, is they try and break the chain of correlation that a lot of EDRs are trying to build in order to have a good set of detections against some of these advanced techniques. And so that's why if you can break that correlation chain you can run things that even would be considered noisy and they will get through no problem. So we have seen progress on it though. I know EDRs are getting better and better. So that's at least an optimistic perspective, I think, on that.
Yeah, there's definitely some areas where like some adversaries, because of the using LawBass and having like C2 come off of different things, like C2 off of Run DLL32, like that's pretty noisy and suspicious. So they've started process hollowing into like a web browser so that the C2 traffic actually just looks normal. So you have different things like that. Well, we have about 1 minute left. Yeah, so I was going to ask, what are the closing thoughts, Tim?
Oh, well, first of all, thanks everybody for, again, giving us your time on a Friday, if you're here in the States, and or your weekend, if you're there in the future across the world. So, hope you've enjoyed it. Know we had some issues with the lab environment, so apologies to anybody that was affected by that. We definitely are continuing to work, and we work off of feedback for these things. So we'll look to make that better in the future. And just, appreciate you sitting here, giving us good talking points to work off of too. And, hopefully you've learned a couple things before you head into either weekend, or if you're already there, then we'll be joining you here soon. Anything else, Chris?
Just thank you for attending. Check out our next workshop. I don't know when it's going to be yet, but
yeah, we're still
check out our marketing. Thanks for stopping by, and have a great weekend. And happy hunting and emulation. Hopefully y'all have taken a few things that you can do and implement in your environment and make it more secure.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.